Hi friends, this is Lisa. Welcome to Nitty Kitty Designs. Today we're going to learn how to do the purl stitch. Let's get started. Okay, you've already learned how to cast on stitches to your needle. You already have learned how to do the knit stitch, and you can get by with knitting just knowing that one stitch, but you can expand your knit box with learning the second main stitch, which is the purl stitch. And once you learn the purl stitch, you'll be able to expand that knit box to so many more designs and patterns. So let's begin. Okay, so to begin with, we have the stitches cast on and they're placed on the left knitting needle, and then the right knitting needle is empty. And just like in knitting, you're going to start with the first stitch on the left needle by inserting the right needle in there, but instead of going up like that to create an X with the needle underneath for knitting, we're going to do the opposite, which is basically what purl stitch is the opposite of knitting. So we're going to go down, and we're going to have the right needle on top of the left needle. So we have to secure that with our thumb as we take this working yarn and we wrap it counterclockwise around the right needle that's on top to create that loop that's on the right needle. Can you see that loop? And what we're going to do is we're going to take the right needle and we're going to go backwards so that we can catch the loop. Oops, there it is. Now the right needle is behind the left needle. There's the loop. That's our new stitch. And so now that we have the new stitch on the right needle, we take the old stitch off the left needle by pulling it off. Now with purl, the other thing to remember is you always have the yarn in front of you, never behind. This would be behind the right needle. You want it in front of the right needle. So when you're doing your second stitch of purl, and then this cast on tail right here, that gets a little annoying, so you just have to hold it maybe with your left hand. Hold it with your left hand and left needle to keep it out of the way until you get a few rows, and then it won't be such a nuisance. But anyway, so now we have the working yarn towards the front, we have the new stitch on the right needle, and we're about to do our second purl stitch. So we take our right needle, insert it into the top stitch on our left needle. We're going to insert it by going down the stitch. So go in the loop there and go down to make a cross so that the top needle is the right knitting needle. And then we're going to take the yarn that's in front and we're going to wrap it around the right needle counterclockwise. And we're going to catch that loop by slipping this right needle down and towards the back of the left needle. There's the new stitch, and then we're going to slip the old stitch from the left side of the needle off. There's stitch number 2. Let's try that again. Remember, it's the opposite of knitting. Have the yarn in front. The yarn should hang easily in front now. It's just when you're starting the new row that it doesn't always hang where you want it to. And also, if you're making a mistake somehow, you'll realize, like, you're you're purling. And if you're purling and the yarn isn't in front, then there may have been a mistake from a previous stitch. That's okay though. This is how we learn. So let's do the third stitch. We're going to take the right needle, insert it down the loop that's on the top left needle, create that X, wrap the yarn counterclockwise around the right needle, creating a new loop on the right needle that you're then going to push towards the back of the left needle, and there's the new stitch. And now that we have the new stitch on our right needle, we can take the stitch off, old stitch off our left needle for our third stitch. And we'll go down, around, through, and off. Down, around, through, off. And this gets rhythmic, just as knitting does. You just have to get the hang of it. Remember the mantra, down, around, through, off. Down, around, through, off. Now once you get the hang of doing the purl stitch, then you'll have the 2 basic stitches under your belt. And then you've expanded your knit box to so many different designs and patterns. Good. You finished a row. Now, when you finish this row, you have to transfer the needle that has the stitches back to your left hand, and then you transfer the empty needle to your right, and you begin the next row. To begin the next row of purl, you do the same thing as your first row. You're going to make sure that the yarn is on top of the right knitting needle to start, and then you're going to insert your needle down the first stitch and wrap that yarn around the right knitting needle to create a new loop, and then take that new loop to the back of the left knitting needle, there's the new stitch, and then release the old stitch that's on the left needle. Okay, make sure the yarn's in front. You're going to go down, around, through, and off. Down, around, through, off. We'll finish this row. This is what it's starting to look like as I purl every row. You might notice that it's similar looking to the garter stitch. Here's the garter stitch. I think the only difference is when you knit every row, like this swatch right here on my right, it's a little more of a tighter knit than when you purl the row. I could be wrong about that, but it just seems like that to me. So we'll continue working on this swatch for a couple more inches. Okay, I've just purled a bunch of rows, so I'm going to cast off the stitches to finish the swatch. And the way I'm going to bind off the stitches, I'm saying cast off and bind off interchangeably. In order to bind off the stitches from the knitting needle that I have purled, I'm going to bind off purlwise. That way it keeps it in pattern. And to do that, you just purl a couple stitches, the first 2 stitches from the needles, and then you're going to take the first stitch that you purled and you're going to take your left knitting needle and insert it in and go over the second stitch on your right knitting needle, and you've just bound off your first stitch. But you need 2 stitches to work with when binding off, so you need to purl another stitch. You've got the 2 stitches on your right needle, so take the left needle and go into the first purl stitch on the right needle and pull that over the second stitch to create your second bind off stitch. And you continue in this process until you have all the stitches purled and bound off. I'm down to my last stitch on my left needle, and I have 1 stitch on my right. I'm going to purl that stitch on the left needle. Now I have 2 stitches on my right needle. I'm going to bind off the 1 stitch, and I'm left with 1 stitch on my knitting needle. So I'm going to take the scissors and cut the yarn, and then loosen the stitch that's on my knitting needle so that the loop is larger, so that I can feed the cut yarn through it and pull to tighten. And voila! You've just bound off purlwise. This is what it looks like on one side of the purl stitch, and that's what it looks like on the other side of the purl stitch. Very pretty. The purl stitches that you created here, these are all purl rows on both sides of the fabric. It looks very similar to the swatch that's knitted. This is a knit swatch, and both sides are knit, every row. It's called the garter stitch. Both of these are very similar by doing completely knitting or completely purling for every single row. But the cool thing is if you combine the rows, you create a new stitch. This is called a stockinette stitch. This is when you knit your first row and you purl your second row. So this would be considered, for most projects, the right side of the fabric. And this is what the knit stitch will look like when you knit on the right side. And then the wrong side of the fabric is the purl stitch. Now this might look similar to the garter stitch, but you can tell the distinction because the back side is much tighter a look than the actual garter stitch. So that's how you can see the difference. Remember, this is all knit. These rows here, every row, each side, this side's knit, this side's knit, this side's purl, this side's purl. They're pretty little rows of bumps. But when you combine the knit and purl rows, the front side of the fabric, this is considered the knit stitch, and the back side of the fabric, this is considered the purl stitch. This is when you knit one row, and then the next row is purl, and then the next row would be knitting, and then the next row would be purl, and so on and so on. So I hope that wasn't confusing. I hope it helped you. And now I hope you have more tools in your knitting belt so you can create more awesome projects. And if this video has helped you, please give it a thumbs up and let me know in comments what stitches or patterns you'd like to learn next. I'd love to help you become a better knitter. And don't forget to subscribe for more tips and tutorials. And thanks!